Hi! Today I want to talk about one of the best books I've read recently. It's Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, so not quite perfect, but really approaching perfection. I think that knowing more about Dangarembga's life makes reading this book a richer experience because even though it's fiction, a lot of things that happened in her life also happen in this book. I think that sort of explains part of why it feels really real and engaging because she lived it, so she's able to bring that to the writing. Dangarembga was born in 1959 in Rhodesia, which is what Zimbabwe was called when it was still a British colony, and her parents were teachers at a mission school, which that becomes important once you read the book. And her mother was actually the first Black woman to receive a bachelor's degree in Rhodesia. So you can imagine that education really played a big role in Dangarembga's young life. It also means that she spent much of her time as a child outside of Rhodesia and in England as her parents pursued their educations. You can imagine how, as a child, that could be pretty alienating to be between these two cultures, the English education that she's receiving and also her family and her native language, Shona, which eventually she forgot and had to reacquire. So that brings us to one of the big questions of this book, which is getting an education still good for you, even if it makes you less happy in the long run? And one of my favorite discussions of this was from a South African YouTuber. When I looked, there are a couple different ways to say her name. I'm gonna go with Kanisa. She talked about how this is still a modern dilemma, that in South Africa there's a conversation about decolonizing education, and so that would mean making it less European, maybe less English instruction, and more instruction on what it means to be from South Africa. And she put really well the dilemma that a modern South African parent might have, where you want your children to be successful and to have all of the opportunities to get a great job and be prosperous as possible. So you want them to learn English and to learn the skills that a Eurocentric world is going to expect. But you also lose something there. You want your children to have a decolonized education and understand who they are and be proud of who they are. And so it sort of brings up, what is the purpose of education? Is it to prepare us for jobs, or is it to feed something deeper in the soul? And I think the answer is probably both. And so it's a question of how we balance those priorities. This book also asks, as Kanisa put it, what does feminism free women from? For Kanisa, the men's actions in this book really made sense. To give some context, so there's a young girl, Tambu. She wants to get an education, and the patriarchs in her family aren't supportive of that idea. And so Kanisa argues that many of the educated characters in this book end up pretty miserable, so it could be seen as a burden. And also that for Tambu, becoming educated would also come with the responsibility of lifting her family out of poverty, and that's a heavy thing for a young girl to decide. So for her, the patriarchs weren't necessarily being oppressive, they were just protecting this young girl that they cared about. I also watched another review from a South African YouTuber. Her channel's called A Time to Share Books, and her name is Tsaffatso. And she's very pro-education, definitely a feminist. She had a great quote, I wrote it down. "The kitchen is a nice place, but that should not be my designated place as a woman." I liked that. And so for her, feminism frees women like Tambu to be able to make their own choices and decide whether they want to be educated. And even if that makes them more unhappy, that's their choice. So personally, I come down on the side of Tsaffatso, but it was really interesting to learn more about Kanisa's point of view and understand. I hadn't even thought of the men in this book as protectors. They more seemed uniformly evil to me. So I even thought when I was reading that they were a little unrealistic, like so oppressive, so forceful. I thought it was sort of heavy handed, but then to hear Kanisa's point of view, I mean, maybe it really wasn't heavy handed. Maybe that's a great depiction of what life would have been like for a young black woman in the 1960s in Rhodesia. I'm really glad that Tsitsi Dangarembga got an education because it means that she was able to read this great book. But from what I've read, that education also caused her to feel alienated and to experience racism and to be torn between two cultures. So, is it selfish for me to be glad that she experienced that so that I get to read her work? I don't know.